All right. I don't want to make this super formal. I just kind of have the slides to more so keep me from going on tangents. They probably won't be super formal lectures, like I said. Just kind of want to get some ideas out there. Probably start putting things out like this weekly. Just figured this was one thing that was on my mind currently. So there's probably not going to be any rhyme or reason why I'm putting these out. Just probably more so topics that come to mind. Anything that you guys have any questions about, just speak on them weekly. Just a way for me to get a little bit more longer form information out there. So this week's topic is basically just going to be intentionality in training. You can see it here on the title. And really what I want to dive into here is just like, what are your training goals? Understanding that different goals are going to require different inputs to receive the desired output. And then just looking at like the viewpoints of like what is a micro lens versus what is a macro lens. Understanding that being intentional in training isn't just exercise focused, right? It's actually like multi-layered. Think of it like an onion, right? And then how do you earn autonomy in your training, right? How do you earn that auto regulation people generally talk about? So biggest thing when you're understanding what performance means in your own terms, right, is like you're training for something in the first place. So like, what is it, right? You can see like I just wrote down like general fitness, any sort of sports, bodybuilding, strength sports. So think powerlifting, technically strongman a little bit, and Olympic weightlifting, right? And then understanding that when you have this underlying thought of like, okay, here's what I'm actually training for, and the idea of training being having an intended purpose for working out, right? Working out is purely just like exercising, right? But like training, you have a specific goal in mind that you want to accomplish from it. With the understanding, like I said, different training goals require different inputs to receive the desired output. Your program can now start to form when you understand that there's like a specific goal going on in your training. So this viewpoint that I talked about, the micro versus macro viewpoint, is like macro sense being like very large scale. So looking at it almost like from like a top down, right? So like what is the program goal? What are any constraints that you're faced with, right? So think about like equipment availability, time availability, anything along that nature. Are you injured? Whatever it may be, that's like a big thing to base your program around. What is the actual like skill focus, right? Like if you're trying to actually train for your sport, it's like understanding that you have a whole different side of training that you also need to accomplish. So think of it like practice sessions, any sort of like skills coaching, whatever that may be. And then, just overall, just like the training focus. That is the biggest thing, is like if you're training to get better at a sport, if you're training to get better at, any sort of goal. So like bodybuilding, right? You're trying to increase like hypertrophy. You're looking at Olympic weightlifting, you're trying to increase your performance on 2 lifts. If you're looking at powerlifting, you are trying to move the most or the maximal load, the highest load as possible in the most efficient manner, right? Looking at it from like a micro sense, just looking at more like intricate, granular, right? That's looking at each individual training session. That's looking at the exercise selection you're picking for your program. That's looking at how you actually execute each exercise, and anything that comes up with life, right? Like, okay, well, I can't make this training session because whatever reason, time got cut off, so I only got like 10 minutes to warm up, whatever it may be. Everything more granular is what I'm talking about in a micro perspective, and anything more macro is what I'm going to talk about, like a larger scale perspective here. This is like the biggest thing I wanted to get into, though, is like intentionality is an onion. I think that's like the best way that I could describe it when someone asks me kind of like, well, what do you mean? When I hear intentionality being talked about more so like on social media from other people, it's like, okay, I have to have this certain intention with a specific exercise or a specific drill, right? So when you're executing like a barbell back squat, it's like, okay, I'm thinking this. Or if you're executing a drill. So when I was training a lot of throwers, right, it'd be like, okay, well, what are you thinking during this specific drill? I think intentionality is missed because there is such a larger scale that it actually applies to than just a specific exercise on a specific day, right? And I kind of layered these things for how I think about intentionality and how I go about building out phases, specific training sessions, whatever it may be, right? So starting with the overall goal, what is it, right? So once again, we look back to, like I said, are you training for a sport? Are you training for something else? So then with that, you kind of understand what the overarching goal of the training program is going to be. So when you're dealing with now individuals, you're like, okay, well, like, what is our first plan of attack with this person, with this team, whatever it may be, right? It's like generally we go to what we call like a lowest hanging fruits, initial needs, whatever it may be, right? You can kind of start archetyping guys, archetyping yourself, whatever, on this. So you see like a bigger athlete, stronger, a little bit more, I guess, tightly wound. You're like, okay, he or she, I'm sorry, probably backs away from the weight room a little bit more, add in a little bit more of that like speed component, that elasticity component to things, and maybe gain some range of motion, right? You see the undersized athlete who probably needs to get a little bit more physical. You kind of have an idea of where to go from there, right? You can archetype, you can bucket however you need to, however you want to, but understanding the overall goal and then looking at an individual or a team setting, right, and seeing the most immediate things you can start to make progress on, that's kind of where that second layer gets there for me. And then, like I said, still from a macro perspective, I'm looking at the constraints that an athlete or a team setting needs to be able to work within, right? So whether that's time, equipment, duration of even like a skill setting if they are a team sport athlete, whatever it may be, understanding like the main goal is huge, but if we don't really work within the constraints we're given, it doesn't really matter, right? I can give someone like a plan that requires an hour of corrective work, 2 hours of strength training, and then in the middle of the week have more so dedicated days like plyometrics and sprinting, right? But if they aren't allotted any of that time, then like the plan doesn't really matter, right? So optimal, yes, does exist, and like by the definition of the word, like it has to exist, right? An optimal program does exist, but that means we have whatever time is allotted to us, whatever equipment is allotted to us, and training sessions aren't missed, right? That means everything is going as planned, everything's going perfectly. We know that we will never be able to deal in optimal. So we have to kind of find robust things, right? That's why I kind of have this macro to micro viewpoint is the whole idea of intentionality in training is to build something that is robust so that way progress continues to grow rather than feel like there needs to be this perfect path that happens, perfect program, and when things go awry it's just like kind of gone to shit. That's not the case. If we can build out some of this intentionality, you'll be a whole lot better. So from the constraints, from the understanding like the individual or team's immediate needs as well as like the overall goal, that's kind of how program structure is framed, right? Like, okay, I'm allotted this amount of time with this equipment on these days. So how do I start to begin to build that out? From there, that is where excellent exercise selection, drill selection, whatever it may be, becomes huge, right? It's like you need to think about 100 different things in terms of how exercises fit into a program, right? Are you training certain musculature? Are you trying to, rehab someone from an injury? Do you need to think about, okay, I can't put deadlifts early on in the week because then recovery throughout the weight room is pretty shot for the rest of the week, right? I can't have too much load in a certain pattern. All of these things matter when it comes to exercise selection because, right, with good exercise selection, good exercise order, whatever, that is how almost robustness starts to get built out as well. And this doesn't just go for the weight room, right? It's like you wouldn't have multiple high intent skill sessions throughout the course of a week, back to back to back, right? You probably wouldn't overload someone with a lot of like skill sessions where it's super detailed on we need to learn a skill because there's only so much like bandwidth that someone has for thinking power. There's so many things in regard to understanding that selecting certain exercises and understanding where to put them come into play. And I think that's something that doesn't get addressed, as much as it should, right? Like we all have this understanding that you have to be able to create, a stimulus, recover, to then create an adaptation to that stimulus. We all understand that. But I think it goes a lot deeper than people realize because once we start understanding what the goal of an exercise is, we then aren't married to an exercise, but we're married to like the stimulus that it's trying to create, right? So don't be married to a specific exercise. Understand the stimulus or the shape you're trying to create in the weight room, but understand the stimulus or the shapes and patterns you're trying to create in your skill sessions. And that is now how you are able to pick and choose exercise selections. Going into exercise execution now, right? The most granular level, an exercise is great, but if you aren't performing it how it's intended to be performed, then you're either missing out on a skill component of things or you're missing out on training certain structures. So I can only speak, like I said, on my experience training a lot of throwers, right? I can give someone two different exercises, right? Especially two different throwing drills. But if they are continually executing them almost in the same fashion, then the drills are almost meaningless because they're now just training the same pattern in two different ways, basically now creating the same amount of, I guess, intended fatigue on one sort of stimulus when I'm trying to create two different adaptations, if that makes sense. And I think thinking about exercise in a more simple way, if I were giving someone a certain amount of hinging volume and intensity and a certain amount of squatting volume and intensity, and they are almost performing these two patterns relatively the same, it's like I've just now doubled the volume and intensity than the program was originally prescribed, right? So we think about a squat, we think about the knees bending and the pelvis moving, up and down. If we think about a hinge, we generally don't want a ton of knee flexion, and we want the pelvis moving, laterally, right? So horizontally in a hinge for the pelvis, and then up and down vertically for the pelvis in a squat. And that's pretty simple, right? But if we start to think about how most athletes now execute those patterns, right, we see a lot of like the squatting, right, instead of like up and down, we see it start to do more like this, right, where it's not completely moving horizontally, it's not completely moving vertically, but it's almost somewhere like in between, right? And the same thing with a hinge. We want this pelvis to be moving laterally, but sometimes when athletes start, trying to cheat range, we start to see it like drop off a little bit, right? So it's the same thing in skill, whatever skill work you're prescribing, whatever exercise you're prescribing, there is an actual reason to be a stickler on how it is being performed. Once again, with the understanding of why you're choosing that exercise execution can now be easier, right? So if I were to look at a bench press for a power lifter is going to be executed different than a bench press for a thrower. That is just due, if we go back again, right, to the overall goal, that is due to the inputs having to be different for a training goal to receive the desired outputs, right? For a power lifter, I'm trying to find where they can move the highest loads with the most efficient, range of motion as possible. So it's like we want to minimize the range that they move through so they can increase the total load that they move. For a thrower, right, we do want to develop some upper body strength, but we also want to make sure that we are training the musculature, right? Thinking about like the pec, thinking about the triceps, thinking about even some like the anterior delt stuff. We do want to train that musculature to, yes, have better, force through like better outputs through those muscles. We want all of those adaptations that are going to transfer to throwing to happen. So we are going to execute that bench press in a multitude of ways, right? We're going to make sure that like range of motion is good. We're going to make sure stability through the move is good. We're even going to probably add a little bit more of that like lighter load speed component if we are programming an exercise in a certain like phase. So there is a little bit more nuance to how we would program a thrower or a bench as throwers than say like a power lifter would, right? The goal, yes, is to move the weight, sure, right? But the intentionality of each of those exercises based on the overall training goal is going to be so much different. So I think that's like a big point, right? Is like both a thrower, right? You can even think of it like javelin, quarterback, baseball, whatever you want to be, a thrower and a power lifter. If they are bench pressing, yes, the goal is to move the weight in that pattern. But the intentionality in which they are going to do those two things are going to be vastly different, right? Because they have different training goals. This is where, I think most people start to earn auto regulation. And what I mean by that is like people love to shit on like percentage based training and, like super linear progress when it comes to like, okay, on this week you're doing, this weight for this many reps, and the next week it's almost like planned out and like, a certain step or a certain like increase in intensity or volume, right? And like people love to shit on that because they're like, well, we don't know how someone's going to recover from the stimulus. We don't know everything that life is going to throw at us. We don't know the demands of our skill at each given day. So we can't really just prescribe things in the weight room, right? And that's exactly true. But I don't think intentionality is on point enough to actually earn some auto regulation. And that's kind of like the whole point of percentage based training and things like that is it is like roadblocks and it is goals and benchmarks to hit throughout a session. Now, personally, I agree that percentage based training and things along that nature that are super stringent in nature are very hard to get behind, at least in my opinion. But I also think it is, on the athlete or on the trainee to have better, understanding of what they're actually trying to do session to session so that they can make decisions based on like how they're feeling on a certain day, right? RPE, auto regulation, whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to subscribe to, you still have to earn that, right? So when I talk about this from an athlete sense, it's like intention is now deeper than body part splits when we talk about the weight room, right? We tend to see that like skill sessions generally have a very, very specific focus. It's like, okay, I'm trying to either remap this pattern, I'm trying to learn a new pattern, or I'm trying to have output in, whatever drill I am doing for that day. But in the weight room, we don't really see that as much. We see like generally like, well, what do you have for training day? Well, I have total body. Oh, well, I have upper body. Well, I have speed lower, whatever it may be. It's like that is the complete opposite way of how to gain that auto regulation, right? It's like I kind of mapped it out here. It's like you understand like the goal of the certain phase that you're in, then think about the weekly structure of what it takes to build that phase up. Think about what you're going to put in each session, and then you can go exercise selection, intensity, substitutions, whatever. Now, I know this seems like a little bit difficult to grasp, but it truly, truly is as simple. So this is just something I wrote out for myself when I was training a few years ago to throw, right? So this is when I was still trying to be a position player as well as, so I was training as a two-way basically, but I really wanted to play the field. And from the coach's perspective, the two things that I really needed to focus on were increasing throwing velocity and increasing my home to first time, or decreasing my home to first time, so making it better. So that was like the overall goal of my offseason, right? I wanted to increase my infield throwing velocity so that way I could, either play third or first where I wasn't pigeonholed just at first. And I also needed to get faster, right? I needed to decrease my home to first time. So you can see that big red, right? That is the overarching goal of what my offseason needed to look like. So I have that in the back of my mind that that is the overall thing that needs to happen from the offseason for me to consider it a successful offseason, right? So from there, I built out my throwing and training plan. And then, what that should look like throughout the course of my offseason. Then I understood what I needed to do and what kind of worked best for me throughout the week. And then from there, I can make any modifications, basically on a day-to-day basis based on how I was feeling. So I wrote up a little chart here, right? And I kind of phased it on the right so that way you guys could see what I was talking about. So the overall goal, right, we see increase infield velocity and then decrease home the first time. So in between that, I wrote I had 2 high intent throwing days, 2 moderate days. So I'm basically there working on mechanics. And now that's not just right mechanics of like I need to throw better. I also needed to have transitions from the glove. I needed to be able to throw to bases. I needed to do all that. All of that was encompassed in my skill work. And then I had 2 full recovery days where it's like I was just going to make sure my arm was ready to go when it needed to. I needed to see how much volume and intensity I could handle. While taking those recovery days, I was able to actually gauge, okay, on these certain days or after these certain days, I didn't feel so good. So I kind of knew then, taking it as like another benefit to having intentionality with training, if I needed to kind of auto regulate myself out of practice to feel good for either the subsequent days or the weekend, I kind of knew how to manage that because throughout the course of the off season, if I did, a certain volume or a certain intensity, I kind of knew how I was already going to respond to that at point, right? So like those 2 recovery days were basically just like note taking days for me on how I felt days after either high intensity days or moderate days, right? And then just 1 full off day. And then same thing kind of in the weight room. I planned, I was like, I had 2 heavy lifting days. I did not need to be in the weight room anymore because I already built a very, very high, just general strength base. And I was very, very focused on increasing my compounds at that time, which is like, you know, hindsight's 2020, but I just kind of knew that there wasn't going to be a large benefit to me pushing a lot of like heavy stuff in the weight room anymore because I wasn't going to get that much stronger in that short of a period of time But also, going back to it, I was like the tight, you know, tightly bound, overweight athlete. So I kind of knew where I needed to adjust from a training sense. But also, if I needed to get faster, I knew I had to actually sprint more. So you can see I had 2 full sprinting days and then 2 range of motion days, right? Like I said, I was tightly bound. I knew I needed to at least increase some sort of mobility. Not really knowing at the time what I really needed to do. I just kind of knew I needed to get a little bit, more mobile. And this is like looking back, couple-year-old lens, so just bear with me here. One full off day. So there's kind of like the phase structure of what I was doing. My weekly structure looked like I had some shuffle max effort throws, recovery, worked on some mechanics stuff. So like I said, throwing mechanics, even like transitioning stuff out of the glove, throwing to bases, whatever it was, and then throws from positions, right? Like I'm not just trying to blow a radar gun up. I actually needed to throw to a base, to like second base, home, first, all from different positions in the field because I was expected to do that when I got back. Recovery day, more mechanic days, whatever. If we look now at lifting, I have the heavy lifting, I have my recovery day and some light cardio. Then I had a full sprint day, another lifting day, another movement day, and then a full sprint day, right? The point of like this lecture, like this talk, whatever you want to call it, is since I kind of had a great general overview, right? And it wasn't just like total body lift, total body movement, total body, whatever. I had an idea of what exercises I needed to choose and how to make those substitutions, right? So if we look at the lift, yes, it's a total body structure since I only have two of them, but my main focus there was upper body pressing. Okay, upper body pressing strength. Wanted to make sure that that was the one thing that didn't decrease because as a position player at the time, as an infielder mainly in what I wanted to play, I knew that kind of like the upper body was going to be my floor, right? Like if my legs were out of a throw for whatever reason, I still could rely on some of that upper body strength to help me. Remember, this is like a 3-year-old lens, so just stick with me here, just like for the point of it. Then for my movement days, right, I needed to restore range of motion. I needed to lose a little bit of weight, so all the cardio I was doing was low impact, right? So that's why I have zone 2. But understanding my sprinting days as well as my training days, and me being a heavier athlete at the time, I needed to have something where I can burn some calories, have a little bit more low impact, and that's where I would choose like a bike, an elliptical, something like that for my cardio. But that movement day wasn't just like, okay, I just need to move around a bunch and I'll increase range of motion. It's like, no, I had some specific stuff, right? I needed to try and gain a little bit of hip extension, trying to gain some overhead range of motion. All of that stuff that I kind of identified back in the day is where I attacked. So it's not just like, hey, cut that out, dog's playing with a toy over there, sorry. It's not just hey, let's figure out what random exercises I can throw together. It's like, no, I have certain goals of what I want to achieve on these movement days. So if I'm not feeling like doing a certain exercise, right, I can still find a substitution that'll make this adaptation occur. Same thing with the other lifting days, right? It's like, okay, it is a total body structure, but the main overall goal is like vertical force production, right? So you have like here, VFP, right? So that can come in many different forms, right? So say I am just extremely burnt out from throwing from my position on that day, right? Like I've thought too much, I've expanded my bandwidth just on like the skill acquisition part of it. I don't want to now go in the weight room and have to focus on doing something like a front squat, right? Think about in the grand scheme of things, how much I guess skill and how much intention does actually reside in executing a front squat well, right? Like if my whole goal is just to increase vertical force production, I'm going to replace a front squat on a day where I don't feel amazing with something like a belt squat, with something like a leg press, hell, with even something like, loaded jumps, right? Maybe it's a different form of a squat. Maybe it's a hack squat, right? But, this is where like the meat and potatoes of this comes from is like having great intention of what you're going to do for that day is far more beneficial for your whole career and training structure than you'll really understand until you get into the thick of it, right? Is like I have two specific things I wanted to focus on, especially on the training side of things. So that's upper body pressing strength, vertical force production. Tying this all in, right? Like if my whole goal is just to increase upper body pressing strength, I don't necessarily need to do a bench press, right? A half kneeling landmine press. I don't necessarily need to do all of these things. These are all options based on how I'm feeling that day, right? So it's like if we look at the relationship between external stability and force production, I will have a higher potential and higher ceiling to have more output on a chest press machine than I would a bench press, right? Because I am not relying on any external stability requirements on a chest press machine that I would on a bench press, right? It's like, you know, all of these things to take into account are huge because, like I said, if I'm just, mentally drained from thinking about what all has to go into the throw, what all has to go into me fielding, transitioning, all of that stuff, the last thing I want to do is now do like a dumbbell bench press, right? Like there's so much demand on having to stabilize the dumbbells, working through large range of motion, when all my goal for that training session is just increasing my upper body pressing power, right? I am now going to shift from like a dumbbell bench or even like a half kneeling landmine press, whatever, to a chest press machine, right? To a seated, potentially Arnold press, whatever it may be, where I now have that back support, right? I'm using a dumbbell, generally have just a little bit more base of support, seated. There's so many things that go on here that, we can shit on percentage-based training all we want, but if you don't really have a goal for that day, then like, you haven't earned the right to make those substitutions. Okay. And this will help you become more consistent as you're going on in your training, career basically, right? The longer you play, the longer you have to train, right? You're not just going to like randomly stop training one day. Understanding all of these things is huge because, consistency is key. The long game and showing up over and over again, day after day, week after week, year after year, that is how, training needs to happen for everyone. And understanding that these substitutions can be made, all of this is huge. But remember, you have to actually have some good intention with your training to even be able to make these substitutions and these changes, right? It's like everyone on the skill side of things, basically, for the most part, has a good idea. It's like, oh, I'm not feeling it today. I'm going to kind of pivot and, do something else. It's like the same can be done for a lot of the training stuff and still getting the stimulus and adaptation we want to have. You just don't take enough time. And like I didn't as an athlete a lot, take enough time to understand what you're really trying to do, right? This was kind of like just the biggest thing that I've seen, especially now that some of the off-season stuff is ramping up. It's really easy to get caught in like, okay, I need to burn the bridges at both ends. I need to lift heavy. I need to lift weights fast. I need to also increase output on the throw. But it's like all of this stuff is so intertwined. And if you just took a little bit more time, and if we, as a whole, took a little bit more time in understanding what's going on a skill side of things, on a training side of things, we would be able to make a lot smarter decisions that led to a lot more consistency.